I'm starting my next big cosplay project, and this cosplay is going to have a ton of firsts for me. I'm going to be experimenting with screen printing, metal, and so much dyeing, all to make this beautiful royal garment from the manga Yona of the Dawn. And since Soo-Won is royalty, I am covering this cosplay in gold. I am not an expert in any of these techniques, but I will share what I learned while stumbling along through them. Now let's get to the very first step, patterning. Let me introduce you to someone. This is Kelly, and this is my half-scale dress form. If you've never seen one of these before, it's a dress form that is to scale of a human, but half of a human size. So for example, my waist measurement is 26 inches and Kelly has a waist of 13 inches. So everything is exactly one half of my body, and these come in a bunch of different sizes. And I love using this for patterning and experimenting because it uses way less fabric and takes up way less space than a normal mannequin. Now, it's not great for fitting tightly fitted garments. It's mainly for proportions and rough sizing. For example, I love using it for testing hoop skirts. And this is also what I'm going to be using to test the length and proportions on my hanfu layers. I'm using this book for all of my hanfu pattern layers. Now, I normally use Imperial, but my good friend Funhilde said that the metric version fits way better and is easier to use because there's less fractions involved. And I trust her with my life, so I'll recommend the metric version as well, and that's what I bought. So since I'm starting out with a half scale pattern, I'm just going to take my measurements in centimeters and divide those all by 2, then follow the guide from the book, just drawing the style lines, following the instructions. If you're doing your own patterns, you'll definitely need a French curve ruler to help with all of the curves, like in the armpit and the sleeve area. So here is my finished half scale pattern. I'm going to get it cut out and sewn up and see how it looks on Kelly. Okay, cool. I'm really happy with this. There are a couple things I want to change in the final though. I think I want the neckline to be a bit more closed, so I'll shift that over by 4 or 5 centimeters on the final version. I also want to make the sleeve a bit shorter and more full on the inside. Once I make that change on my half scale pattern, I'm just going to measure the length of my half scale sleeve and then double that to find the length of my actual size sleeve. And this shows how useful these things are. I would have wasted so much fabric if I had done a full scale sleeve mock-up, and muslin is getting really expensive these days. Now these are about $100, I'll link one below, but I think they're totally worth the investment. Anyways, I think I feel about ready to do the full scale patterns now, so I'll come back when those 4 patterns are done. Let's get to sewing. Sewing hanfu is really straightforward, so instead I'm going to show you a tip on how to get beautiful, perfect French seams. The trick is really easy, it's just a little time consuming. The only tool you'll need is an iron. Any iron will do, but the mini iron that Clover makes this step really easy. After you sew and trim your first stitching line, you are going to press that seam completely open with your iron. Before you sew the final French seam, you're going to give it another iron. And as you iron, you'll want to make sure that the seam is right in the middle of the fold and placing pins if necessary. Then you just finish your French seam. And with that, the first 2 layers of my hanfu are done. I finished the undershirt as well as the layer 1 robe. I'm really proud of some of the sewing details, like the French seams and all of the hand-done blind hems. But with these 2 layers done, that means I can move on to the gradient layer of the robe. I can no longer avoid the parts that I've been trying to avoid, which is the dyeing. So I'm really nervous. I'm headed into uncharted territory, but I am not a quitter. So I'm gonna do the gradient dyeing first. And I've done regular solid color dyeing before, so I'm a little bit familiar with the basics. And I'm gonna be following December Wind's great tutorial on ombre fabric dyeing to figure out how the hell to do this. So I will link that tutorial below, but let's start mixing some dye. I am dyeing silk fabric, so I'm using Jacquard acid dyes from Dharma Trading. Each jar is about $3 to $4, so it's very affordable. To make a stock solution, I first put on my PPE, which is a dust mask, and gloves. Then I give the powder jar a shake to make sure that the dye is all evenly mixed. Next, I'm going to measure out 1 gram of dye powder on my scale. Now, it's super important that anything you use for dye, like these spoons and this scale, will never be used for food again. So all of my containers and spoons you see me using are strictly for dyeing. I won't even mix dye in the kitchen just to keep the powder contained. So next I'm going to take the 1 gram of powder and add 100 milliliters of warm water to help dissolve the dye. And this results in a 1% stock solution. This is useful because you can replicate exact colors by keeping track of how much stock solution you use for fabric, and you can store your stock solution in the fridge for about 6 months. For a more concentrated stock solution, you just add more dye to 100 milliliters of water. But once the dye is in liquid form, you can dye in the kitchen on your stove top if you want to, and you can take that liquid stock solution anywhere. And it's ready, so it's time to dye. I bought a new stainless steel pot for this project. One tip I did learn from Lutavia Cosplay is really to get the largest pot that you can afford, because it will make everything in the dyeing process easier, and it'll make the dye come out more evenly, and you'll have more flexibility for future projects if you want to dye a lot of yardage. So this was actually over $100, which is really expensive. I didn't realize stainless steel was so pricey, but I know I'll be doing a lot of dyeing in the long run in the future, so I think it'll be worth it. And then I'm also using an induction stove top, which is really portable, so I like to do my dye outside, and this also lets me put my pot on the ground, so it'll be easier to dye. To prep your fabric, you can add stitching lines in 100% polyester thread. And I use these to mark the ombre. I did this before I dyed the fabric, but you couldn't see the thread at all on camera, so I'm showing you now that the dye is complete. But the gray thread marks are where I want the dye to be completely faded by, so when I'm doing my dipping, I will never go past this gray stitching line. The white basting thread divides my fabric into thirds, so I can use this as a visual as I gradient dye to make sure the gradient is gradual and fading by thirds, so I have the most concentrated color at the bottom, kind of middle darkness in the middle, and then up to a very light shade in the last third. They start out really hard to see, but as soon as you start dipping the fabric into the dye, you can see the thread because it stays white, so it becomes really easy to follow, and it makes the whole gradient process really easy. To hold up the fabric, a lot of people use a clothes hanger. I put mine on a wooden dowel, and then I pre-soaked that in lukewarm water so that it was ready to dye. Now to start dyeing. First, I added some citric acid to make the water acidic, which is required to activate acid dye. I also prepped a test swatch of fabric to test the color and the dye process. Using a pipette, I added some dye to keep track of how much dye I was adding. I started with just a little, that was way too little, so I added a little bit more. And then for the ombre, you want to start with very little dye and slowly add more dye as you progress to get the bottom more saturated. That way, as you do the first dips all the way up to the top, you have a very light desaturated dye and then more concentration as you get lower and lower into the gradient. I liked how everything was looking on my test swatch, so I grabbed my real fabric. Another important thing I learned about ombre dyeing from December's video is to always keep the fabric moving. This is a little physically taxing sometimes, but having the pot on the floor helps a lot. The nice thing is you can also take breaks whenever you want. So to do that, all you have to do is submerge your fabric into lukewarm water. And I used my old, smaller dye pot as my regular plain no dye water. But here is the finished fabric. It's still wet, so I'm going to lay it out flat to air dry outside.
The fabric is ruined. I guess when I was leaving it outside to dry, some wind knocked some of the powder dye onto it, so now there's this red splotch like right in the middle. You can't, right there. So just crashing out a little bit about that, because otherwise I was really happy with how it turned out. So I guess always mix your powder dyes far away from everything else.
Like, look at that. It's otherwise so beautiful. It's obviously mostly white, but like, I'm pretty happy with that gradual gradient that I got. Well, the fabric is dry, and you know, despite the few pink dots, which make me really sad, other than that, I'm really happy. The color is really gorgeous, and the gradient is really smooth. So I think that this was a success for the most part. So now I gotta make some trim. And for this trim, I'm going to replicate this gold and blue floral design from these manga covers. For the base, I'm using this gorgeous dual tone silk of teal and purple, and just, oh my god, it's so pretty in the sun. And it's gonna make the teal trim on my other layer be more cohesive with my purplish gradient on this layer. And for the design, I'm going to use Jacquard Lumiere fabric paint in bright gold, and this fabric paint is so sparkly. But instead of painting it with a brush, I am going to use my airbrush for the first time. I've always been afraid of my airbrush, but we're gonna use it anyways. First, I have to get some stencils prepped for the airbrush. I'm going to use Oracle 813 stencil vinyl film, and I actually don't own a cutting machine, so I just zipped on over to my library's makerspace. So consider this your reminder to always check your local library and local makerspace. Mine also has 3D printers and even a Glowforge laser cutter, all to use for free. If you can't afford machinery or just don't have the space for it in your house, there are options out there. Now it's on to weeding. This took a really long time, but it wasn't too difficult. What ended up being really hard was getting the stencil onto the fabric, so I ended up cutting it into smaller portions, which made it more manageable. Once I got the stencils on, I covered up any remaining gaps with a mix of Scotch tape and painter's tape, so that my airbrush paint job would have super crisp lines. All that's left is airbrushing. The instructions suggest adding water to the paint if you're airbrushing, so I added a few drops of water every time I filled up my airbrush bowl, and I had zero issues. No clogs or anything, and the paint came out super bright and opaque, and the best part about the airbrush means that there were no brush strokes on the design. So overall, it was actually really easy. The worst part is cleaning the airbrush in the end, but honestly, even that wasn't so bad. I just followed some other tutorials for that, and I'll link some below. I'm definitely going to be using this method a lot more often since I love how crisp the lines came out and how even the paint job looks. Look how sparkly and lovely the Lumiere paint is. So glad I finally faced my fears and tried out my airbrush. So now I will sew the next layer of my Hanfu off camera. And there it is with the gradient dyed fabric and the golden airbrush trim. Now I'll get started on the final layer, the royal robe for Soo-Won. I'm really worried about how it's going to turn out, but worrying won't get me anywhere. First up, I'll be adding the golden details, and my plan for this is to use deco foil, which is way shinier than HTV or iron-on vinyl. And it's also a lot more durable than directly using gold leaf onto fabric. So the way deco foil works is that you put down one of their adhesives. They have like a spray one, a liquid one. You let it dry a little bit and then iron the foil on top of the adhesive. So after a little bit of experimenting with their different adhesives, I decided for my project to use their gel, and the design is very detailed, so instead of making a bunch of individual stencils, I am going to try screen printing for the first time. There are a lot of different ways to prep a silk screen, and a lot of them use different chemicals and UV exposure, so I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest way, which is just slapping on some temporary vinyl. I cut out my stencil using Oracle 631 temporary vinyl and weeded out the design. Then I pulled it off with some transfer tape and pressed it onto the bottom side of the silk screen. Make sure you put it on the bottom side of the screen, which is the flat side. If you put it on the wrong side, you are going to squeegee the vinyl off and the vinyl is going to get in the way. It was kind of hard to transfer the vinyl onto the silk screen because the transfer tape was really strong, but I just went really slowly and really carefully, and I managed to get it all on there eventually. So the design is now on the screen. For any blank areas and edges, make sure you cover those up with some tape or some more vinyl, because anything without tape can get glue onto your fabric. To figure out the placement of the emblems on my robe, I played around with different layouts and then transferred what I liked onto my pattern. Next, I took my Yona's water-soluble pen and marked the 4 corners of each pattern spot. This marker will disappear completely with water, and it doesn't impact the decofoiling process, so it's a great choice. But always make sure to test on your fabric just to make sure it works. Now to screen print the glue. So I am taking my screen and aligning the design with the 4 blue marks on my fabric. This screen is kind of see-through, but it's still a little hard to see, but once you have it in place, it's time for the scary part. Now, decofoil gel dries and gunks up really fast, so you have to be quick with the next part if you don't want to ruin your frame by getting a bunch of glue dried in it. Take a palette knife or whatever you have around, like I did, to scoop out the adhesive and spread it around the design so the whole thing is covered in a medium thick layer. Next, take your squeegee and, applying heavy but even pressure, scrape and pull it against the screen like so. If you don't apply even and high pressure, the glue will not transfer properly because it will not penetrate through the screen. You can take any of the extra adhesive that ended up on the squeegee and scrape that back into your jar to use later. And here is where the magic now happens. Slowly lift the frame away from the fabric and bam! Okay, it's kind of hard to see since the adhesive is white and clearish, but check out how crisp and sharp the lines are of the design. Oh, it works perfectly. Okay, this is the most important part. Go run to your kitchen sink or hose ASAP. You have to rinse out any glue residue from the silk frame as quickly as possible, otherwise you're going to ruin the frame. You will need a faucet or a hose that has a pressure setting. So if you don't already have one, go buy an attachment for your garden hose or your sink. This water is going to wash all of the glue out of the frame, and then it will be ready to use for a second time. If you're doing a heavily repeated pattern like I am, yes, you will have to do this in between every single pull of the glue. And it is a little bit tedious and tiring, but just do a few at a time and take a break as you need. Anyways, after you've rinsed out the adhesive, that should be the perfect amount of dryness to now iron on the deco foil. I found that it works best when it actually looks kind of white and wet, so I would actually ignore the instructions that tell you to wait till it dries, till it's clear, because if it gets too dry like this, it transfers really poorly and unevenly. So I really recommend doing a lot of tests and experimenting with your iron settings, since every iron is a bit different. But for me, I used a pretty high heat and just applied the iron for a few seconds. Now, another important thing to do, there's a lot of important steps to get the deco foil to come out right, but you do not want to peel the deco foil right away. You want to wait at least 30 minutes until you do to make sure it's fully adhered. I even recommend waiting up to an hour or more before you peel the deco foil off. But once you've waited that long, you can peel it back and reveal your hard work. It's so shiny and sparkly. I love deco foil so much. It comes in a bunch of different colors and finishes as well. So don't think there's only gold or only silver. There's every color. If you do mess up, or if the deco foil doesn't adhere properly to any areas of your design, don't freak out, you can totally fix that. So what you do is you just take the deco foil adhesive and take a little brush or a tool and very carefully and painstakingly paint over that area with the deco foil adhesive. And then, of course, adding more deco foil on top with the parchment paper and ironing it. And as you can see, like I did in this section, it turns out just fine, and
it's completely repairable if you mess something up. So I'm not gonna lie, this robe took a really long time with all that screen printing, but now that it's done, I'm so happy with how it turned out. It's so shiny and so sparkly. Like, look how it looks in direct sunlight. Oh my god, it looks amazing. I couldn't be more thrilled. So I'm kind of shocked by how well it turned out, but I'm so glad I gave it a try and that the mistakes I made were completely fixable. Now, to finally take a break from all the fiber arts, it's time for the golden crown. I wanted to add some detail to the design, so I'm taking inspiration from this Liao Dynasty crown and using a bunch of metal filigree from AliExpress to put together something that kind of looks like the reference. I bought about $40 worth of filigree with some mixed designs, and I'm starting by just laying them out on paper to play around with the layout. If your filigree ever needs to fit a specific shape or isn't just quite working as it is, you can use tin snips to carefully cut the filigree into different custom shapes. Once you're happy with your layout, you can start gluing everything together. Austin Doe has amazing crown tutorials on his YouTube channel, and I'll be using those exact same techniques of gluing everything together layer by layer. I'm using E6000, which is a strong and flexible glue, but remember to use a respirator with it because E6000 is super toxic. Because my crown is so tall, I'm starting with building a sturdy base layer to add more filigree on top of. As I add more pieces of filigree, I just use clamps to hold stuff in place while the glue dries. With the decorative pieces of the crown done, the last step is adding the little circlet base. Filigree on its own like this is pretty flimsy and bends way too easily, so it needs to be reinforced. I'm just taking a wire headband and gluing that in with more E6000 around the rim. See, much sturdier. And that's the crown. It's amazing what just some glue and some rhinestones can achieve. I love the little metal dragon filigree that I snuck in there on the side. This might be the most beautiful thing I have ever made.
And with that, the cosplay is done. Chikupi made me this gorgeous sword to go with the cosplay, but I think it's finally time to try it all on for a cosplay reveal. I hope you found this video helpful. Feel free to drop a comment if you have any questions. Thanks, bye!